Royal Guard notices Charlotte shaking at state dinner. What happens next shocks palace. The grand state dinner was in full swing, and the royal palace glittered with elegance and prestige. The long banquet table was adorned with silverware that sparkled under the dim lights, and every corner of the vast hall was decorated with fresh flowers, shimmering candlelights, and exquisite tapestries. It was an event that marked the height of royal sophistication, attended by dignitaries, diplomats, and the country's most esteemed figures. At the head of the table, the royal family sat like statuesque figures, poised and dignified. Princess Charlotte, the youngest member of the royal family, sat in her designated spot, beside her parents and facing the distinguished guests. The air was filled with murmurs of conversation, the soft clinking of wine glasses, and the sound of cutlery as the guests indulged in the rich, luxurious meal that had been prepared for the evening. Charlotte, with her natural grace, was no stranger to public attention. She had grown up in the spotlight, attending events like this regularly, always appearing composed and confident. But tonight, something felt different. Although her face remained calm, an experienced eye could see that something was amiss. There was a subtle tremor in her hand as she picked up her glass of wine. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight quiver of her fingers, but it didn't go unnoticed by the sharp eyes of the royal guard. He stood at attention, stationed strategically around the room to maintain security. His training was impeccable, his senses always alert to anything out of the ordinary. His duty was to protect, observe, and ensure the safety of the royal family. But over the years, he had also become finely attuned to their well-being in a way that went beyond mere physical security. He knew their habits, their quirks, and their mannerisms. And tonight, something didn't seem right with Princess Charlotte. He kept his gaze on her from his post, watching intently as she reached for her glass once more. The trembling had grown more noticeable, and now it was not just her hands. Her legs, too, seemed to twitch faintly beneath the tablecloth. Her normally smooth demeanor had begun to waver. The guard felt a tight knot form in his chest. Could it be that something was wrong with her? Was she ill? The thought made him uneasy, but there was nothing he could do without alerting the others. He had been trained to be discreet, to remain in the shadows, watching for any potential threat to the royal family. But this wasn't a threat in the conventional sense. It was something more personal, something far more worrying. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. At the far end of the table, the king and queen exchanged a brief glance. They were well aware of Charlotte's usual composure, and the sight of her shaking hands didn't escape their notice. But they, too, said nothing. This was not the time to cause a scene. They continued with their conversations, but both of them were quietly concerned. Charlotte, unaware of the growing concern around her, tried to keep her composure. She engaged in polite conversation with the foreign dignitaries seated beside her. She smiled and nodded, answering questions, but the tremor in her hands wouldn't stop. It was as if a silent force was working against her, an invisible wave of discomfort she could neither explain nor control. She had been feeling this way for days now, but it had worsened tonight. The stress of the royal duties, the weight of constant public scrutiny, the pressures of expectations, all of it was beginning to take its toll. As the dinner progressed, her unease continued to grow. The tremors in her hands became more pronounced, and it was harder for her to mask her discomfort. She briefly excused herself from the conversation, trying to maintain her dignity as she reached for her glass of water. Her fingers, once graceful and steady, now felt as if they were disconnected from her body, trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't help it. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, making it harder and harder to breathe. The royal guard, stationed at a corner near the main entrance, had been watching her all evening. His gaze never wavered. He could sense that something was terribly wrong, though he didn't know exactly what it was. His instincts told him to step in to act, to check on the princess, but protocol kept him in place. He had to stay neutral, impartial, and avoid making any rash decisions. A sudden thought crossed his mind. Should he go to the royal physician and ask them to come over? Would it be too dramatic? Would it cause panic? The last thing he wanted was to make Charlotte's discomfort the center of attention, but as he looked at her again, he could see that her body language had changed. She was no longer just uncomfortable. She was visibly distressed, her posture slumped, and her face now flushed with a pale pallor. Just as he was about to make a decision, something unexpected happened. Charlotte suddenly placed her glass down with a shaky hand, her face contorting briefly in a grimace. The room seemed to slow down for a split second. Guests had not yet noticed, too caught up in their own conversations and toasts, but the royal guard's senses were heightened. Without thinking, he moved, stepping forward with urgency. It wasn't like any of his previous duties, no intruders, no danger to be found. This was something else entirely. It was the royal family's health and safety at risk. He rushed to Charlotte's side, his training taking over as he subtly signaled for others to notice. Without alarming anyone, he caught her just before she could slump further, helping her remain upright. "Princess Charlotte," he murmured quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was enough to stir the attention of the nearby staff. The royal physician, who had been quietly circulating among the guests, was immediately summoned, but it seemed as though the damage had already been done. The tremors had grown worse, and Charlotte could barely keep herself steady. Her once graceful demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an air of distress that was impossible to hide any longer. Behind the scenes, the palace staff went into a flurry of action. The king and queen's eyes locked once again, and without a word, they both understood the gravity of the situation. The public ceremony had to continue, but behind closed doors, everything had shifted. Charlotte's health, once a topic of vague concern, had suddenly become the most important issue of the evening. As Charlotte was escorted to a quieter room by the physician and a couple of palace staff members, the royal guard lingered at the doorway, his duty to protect now more urgent than ever. He had seen many things during his time serving the royal family, but this was something he hadn't expected, a moment of vulnerability from someone who had always seemed untouchable. The event continued, but the atmosphere in the grand hall had changed. Guests continued with their conversations, though there was an undercurrent of curiosity. What had happened to the princess? Why had she left so abruptly? But inside the palace walls, a much deeper conversation was taking place, one that would change how the royal family approached Charlotte's health and how the world would see their youngest member moving forward. The royal guard, standing watch outside the room, couldn't help but wonder what had caused this sudden breakdown. What had been the real source of Charlotte's distress? And how could he, in his role, ever truly know the answer? The dinner had continued without interruption for some time, but the atmosphere inside the royal palace had shifted dramatically. Princess Charlotte had been escorted away by the palace physician and a few staff members, who were carefully monitoring her condition. The grand hall, once filled with the hum of lively conversations and the clinking of glasses, now seemed unusually quiet to those few who remained. There was an unspoken sense of uncertainty that loomed over the room. Guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what had just happened. The royal guard remained in his post, his eyes still focused on the entrance to the royal suite. He could not shake the image of Charlotte's trembling hands. The princess, who had always been composed and serene, had shown a vulnerability that no one had ever expected. It was a side of her that few had seen, and he could feel the gravity of the moment. Though he had done his duty in alerting the staff to her condition, he felt a deep sense of unease that lingered. As he stood there, his mind raced through the events that had unfolded. What had caused Charlotte's shaking? Was it something physical, or was it the immense pressure she had been under lately? He knew well that life in the royal family was never simple. The weight of expectations, the constant public scrutiny, and the countless responsibilities could take their toll on anyone. But Charlotte had always been the picture of grace, seemingly unaffected by the demands of her position. The guard's thoughts were interrupted as a quiet figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the palace staff members who had been with the princess during the incident. The look on the staff member's face told the guard that things were far worse than he had anticipated. With a slight nod, the staff member motioned for the guard to follow them, and he immediately complied. They moved through the palace halls, which were now eerily silent, as if the entire building was holding its breath in anticipation. The air was thick with a sense of concern, and the guard could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. When they reached a quieter part of the palace, the staff member turned to him, their expression serious. "We need to be discreet about this," they said softly. "The princess has been dealing with something we were not prepared for." The guard's heart sank. He had known there was something wrong, but this revelation felt like a punch to the gut. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. The staff member glanced around to ensure no one else was nearby before continuing. It's stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. She's been struggling with all of it for weeks now, but we had no idea it had gotten this bad. Tonight was just the tipping point. The guard listened in silence, his mind racing as the words settled in. Stress and anxiety, those weren't things that the public ever saw. They didn't fit with the image of a calm, composed princess. But now it made sense. The pressures of her royal duties, the constant public appearances, the endless expectations to be perfect, it had all built up. And tonight it had become too much. "We need to get her to rest," the staff member continued. "The physicians are already tending to her, but she needs time to recover from everything." Their voice softened with a hint of sadness. "She's been carrying more than anyone knew." The guard nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He had always admired the princess's strength, but now he saw how much she had been holding in. It was as if she had been forced to carry a weight that no one could see, and it had finally broken her. He thought back to the subtle tremors he had noticed earlier in the evening, how they had grown worse as the night wore on, how she had tried to hide it to push through the discomfort, but in the end, it had been too much. He could only imagine the toll that such a life must take on someone so young. The constant pressure to be the perfect example for the nation, to live up to an ideal that was practically impossible to attain. No one had prepared her for the reality of the responsibility that came with her position. No one had seen how much it was affecting her, not even the closest members of her family. The staff member led the guard into a smaller, more private room where Princess Charlotte had been settled. She was lying on a soft chaise lounge, her eyes closed, her face pale but calm. The physician was sitting beside her, speaking quietly with a concerned expression. It was clear that they had already begun assessing her condition, but there was a sense of quiet worry in the air. The princess had been struggling for some time, and now the full weight of her struggles was beginning to show. The guard approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. He had always known Charlotte as the picture of grace and poise, and now, seeing her in such a vulnerable state, he didn't know how to reconcile this version of her with the one he had always admired. "She needs rest," the physician said softly, not looking up from their notes. "The stress is affecting her body more than we realized. We need to keep her calm and ensure she doesn't overexert herself. She's been pushing herself too hard, and now it's taking its toll." The guard nodded, his thoughts a blur. He had never considered the toll that the princess's life could take on her health. He had always seen her as an icon, someone who represented strength and resilience. But now he saw the cracks in that image, the human being beneath the royal facade, and it made him feel an overwhelming sense of protectiveness. As the minutes passed, the room grew quieter. The staff member left, leaving the guard alone with Charlotte and the physician. The princess stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. When she saw the guard standing there, she gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The guard's heart softened at the sight of her. "You don't need to apologize, Your Highness," he said gently. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Charlotte's eyes filled with a hint of gratitude, though they remained tired and heavy. "I've been trying so hard," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep up this image." The guard felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had seen how hard she worked, how much she had given for the royal family and the country. But he now realized that no one had truly understood the extent of her struggles. No one had seen the toll it had taken on her mental and physical well-being. "You don't have to be perfect," the guard said softly. "You just need to take care of yourself." Charlotte looked at him with a faint smile, her eyes still weary but filled with an unspoken understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. The physician gave the guard a reassuring nod, signaling that it was time for him to leave. "She needs rest now," they said quietly. "Please allow her time to recover." The guard nodded respectfully, his mind still heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. As he stepped out of the room and into the quiet hallway, he couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. This incident, though shocking, had opened his eyes to the reality that the royal family was not immune to the pressures of life. Even the princess, so poised and graceful, was human, with her own struggles and vulnerabilities. He vowed to remain vigilant, to ensure that Charlotte and the rest of the royal family received the care and attention they truly needed. This experience had changed him, and he knew that he would never again view the royal duties in the same way. It wasn't just about protection from external threats. It was about protecting the well-being of those who carried the weight of the crown on their shoulders. The days following Princess Charlotte's collapse at the state dinner were filled with a deep sense of reflection and concern. The palace had fallen into a quieter rhythm, and there was a certain heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. The princess was still resting, and the public was none the wiser about the true cause of her distress. The royal family, though visibly concerned, had decided to keep the details of Charlotte's condition private, at least for the time being. What had happened that evening was a deeply personal matter, and they knew they had to handle it delicately. Behind the palace walls, things were moving in a different direction. A small team of palace physicians, along with Charlotte's closest advisors, were working diligently to understand what had truly happened. They weren't just concerned about the physical toll her body had taken that night. They were equally focused on what had caused her to reach this breaking point. They knew the pressures that came with her role, being in the public eye, maintaining a perfect image, fulfilling royal duties, but no one had realized just how much it was affecting her. Charlotte herself was in a state of mixed emotions. She felt a sense of relief knowing she was being cared for, but also a deep shame and embarrassment over the scene at the dinner. She had always been taught to maintain composure, to be the epitome of grace under pressure. Yet that night, she had shown weakness. Her trembling hands, her unsteady legs, those things she couldn't control had laid her bare for all to see, and she couldn't help but feel exposed. As she rested in her private chambers, her thoughts swirled. She had tried to push through it all. The royal duties, the constant public appearances, the high expectations that weighed down on her every day. But it had become too much. She had been juggling too many responsibilities, hiding too many fears, and covering up too much of her own struggles for far too long. She had felt isolated in her role as a princess, thinking she was expected to be perfect, to never falter. The overwhelming pressure of her position had built up, and now it was painfully clear. Despite the quiet solitude of her room, Charlotte wasn't alone. She had family members who were there for her, though they too were grappling with their own concerns. Her mother, the Queen, had been particularly shaken by what had happened. She had always known how difficult life in the royal family could be, but she had never imagined it would push her daughter to this point. Watching her daughter struggle, watching the physical toll stress had taken on Charlotte, was a hard reality to face. The Queen had always been a figure of strength, the one who kept the palace running smoothly, but even she was finding it difficult to know how to help her daughter through this. The idea that Charlotte had been silently carrying such a heavy burden, something so many hadn't seen, was a painful realization for the Queen. She had spent so much time focusing on the royal duties and responsibilities, perhaps to the detriment of her own family. Now she found herself wondering if she had failed her daughter by not seeing the signs sooner. But Charlotte, for all her grace and poise, was a strong young woman. Even in the midst of this crisis, she knew she had to face her struggles head-on. She could no longer hide behind the image of the perfect princess. It was time to let go of the facade, to let people see her for who she really was, a person who had been struggling, a person who needed help. But that was easier said than done. There was a deep fear inside her, a fear that being vulnerable would cause others to see her as weak, unfit for the role she had been given. She was terrified that if the world knew the truth, they would no longer look at her with the same reverence. In the weeks that followed, the royal family decided to take a different approach to Charlotte's health and well-being. They began to consider the idea of seeking outside help, bringing in experts who could assist Charlotte in managing her stress and anxiety. This wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about addressing the mental and emotional toll that had been building up for years. The palace had always been a place of great tradition and formality, but now they knew that it had to evolve. If Charlotte was going to continue her role, she needed support, and it couldn't just be from within the palace walls. It had to come from a place of understanding and compassion, something the royal family hadn't fully embraced before. Charlotte's mother, the Queen, arranged for a private meeting with some of the country's top mental health professionals. The decision was a bold one, especially for a royal family that had long kept such matters under wraps. Mental health was often seen as a private, personal issue, not something to be discussed openly in the public eye. But now, it was clear that silence and secrecy were no longer viable options. Charlotte was hesitant at first. She had always been told to keep her feelings in check, to maintain the royal dignity that was expected of her. The idea of opening up about her struggles felt foreign, even uncomfortable. But as the days went on, and she began to see the support being offered to her, she started to realize that it was okay to seek help. She wasn't a failure for acknowledging that she couldn't handle everything on her own. She wasn't weak for admitting that she needed someone to help her navigate the pressures of her royal life. Her first session with the therapist was a quiet, calm experience. Charlotte was nervous at first, unsure of how to express what she had been feeling for so long. But as the conversation began, she slowly opened up. She spoke about the immense pressure she had felt growing up in the public eye, the constant judgment, and the never-ending expectations to be perfect. She admitted the fears that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years, the fear of failure, the fear of letting people down, the fear of not being enough. As she spoke, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't alone in this. So many people, even those who appeared strong and invulnerable, were facing their own battles. This wasn't something unique to her. It was a shared human experience. The realization was both freeing and humbling. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt like she was allowed to be human. She didn't have to live up to a standard of perfection that was impossible to maintain. The sessions continued over the following weeks, and with each one, Charlotte grew stronger. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were days when the weight of her responsibilities felt unbearable. But she learned to take things one step at a time, to prioritize her well-being above all else. She started to let go of the need to please everyone and began to focus on what made her feel whole as a person, not just as a princess. Meanwhile, the royal family began to adopt a new approach to public life as well. There was an unspoken agreement that Charlotte's health and well-being would come first, and that they would no longer prioritize image above all else. The palace staff, too, began to work in a way that supported Charlotte's mental and emotional needs. The rigid structure that had once defined royal life began to shift, and in its place was a more compassionate, understanding environment. The transformation wasn't just about Charlotte. It was about a royal family acknowledging the importance of mental health and showing the world that even those who seem untouchable have their own struggles. It was about recognizing that strength doesn't come from perfection, but from vulnerability, growth, and the courage to face one's fears. As Charlotte continued her recovery, she began to feel a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just the princess anymore. She was a woman who had learned to embrace her humanity, flaws and all. And in doing so, she had become even stronger than before, ready to face the world with a newfound sense of peace and understanding. The days following Princess Charlotte's time of rest and recovery were a turning point in the royal family's approach to her well-being. The change was not only visible in Charlotte's own demeanor, but also in the way the palace functioned. The decision to open up about her struggles with stress and anxiety had been a bold one, and while it had initially been difficult, Charlotte's vulnerability led to an unexpected shift. No longer was it a matter of hiding behind the strict traditions that defined royal life. Now, there was an understanding that health, both physical and mental, was just as important as duty. Charlotte's recovery was slow but steady. The days spent in solitude, reflecting on the pressure she had carried for so long, began to ease her mind. No longer was she forced to maintain the perfect image of a princess who could do it all. Instead, she allowed herself the grace of imperfection. She wasn't ashamed to ask for help anymore. She wasn't afraid to show her human side. As her strength returned, so did her confidence, but it was different now. She was no longer the same princess who had tried to live up to everyone's expectations at the expense of her own well-being. Her family, too, had begun to change. The king and queen, once so focused on their royal duties and the public image of their family, now saw things from a new perspective. The health of their children, and especially Charlotte, became their top priority. It was a difficult transition for them, as they had always been taught to prioritize their role over personal matters, but seeing their daughter go through such a personal battle changed their thinking. They understood that the crown could only be worn by someone who was healthy in mind and body. The queen had always been a pillar of strength, someone who was the embodiment of royal composure. But now, in light of Charlotte's struggles, the Queen began to see the importance of showing a different side. She realized that vulnerability could be a strength in itself. Her own efforts to support Charlotte were filled with compassion and understanding, something that had always been present but had never been as openly expressed. It wasn't just about being a mother in private anymore. It was about showing the world that being a mother also meant being there in the most difficult moments, when it mattered the most. As Charlotte began to reintegrate into royal life, it was clear that she had changed. She no longer walked into a room with the same guarded expression. The weight of her role was still there, but it no longer defined her. Her strength came from her honesty with herself and her family. She began to attend royal engagements again, but there was something different in her approach. She was more relaxed, more open. She spoke to people not as the untouchable princess, but as someone who understood the pressures they faced as well. Charlotte's story was no longer just one of royalty and power. It was now a story of personal growth, resilience, and the courage to face the darkest parts of her own life. And the more she shared her journey with the public, the more the world saw her as a real person, someone who could relate to their struggles. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a human being. Her openness about her mental health struggles had a ripple effect, not just within the royal family, but in the country as well. People began to see that even those who seemed to have everything could still be struggling. It created a space for others to speak openly about their own challenges. Mental health, once a topic shrouded in silence, was now a subject of conversation. The palace's approach to well-being became a model for how society could handle such issues with greater empathy and understanding. Charlotte became a symbol of strength in a different way than before. It wasn't her perfect royal appearances or her flawless performances at public events that made her admired. It was her ability to be real. People were drawn to her honesty, to her willingness to step out from behind the walls of perfection and show her true self. The courage to say, "I need help," and to take the necessary steps to heal became her new form of power. The royal family as a whole began to place more emphasis on well-being. They took a more active role in supporting not only Charlotte, but also the rest of the family in a way they never had before. Mental health experts were brought in to guide them in dealing with the stresses of royal life, and the palace became a place where individuals were encouraged to take care of themselves, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. It was a shift that had never been considered before, but it felt like the natural next step in the royal family's evolution. While Charlotte's recovery was a personal journey, it also had a profound effect on the royal family's public image. No longer was there a need to maintain the facade of perfection. The public's perception of royalty began to shift as well. The people saw that the royal family was willing to evolve to show their humanity. It wasn't about perfection anymore, it was about being authentic and caring for one another. For Charlotte, the journey was far from over. There would be moments of doubt, and there would be days when the pressure would return. But she now knew that she didn't have to face it alone. She had the support of her family, and more importantly, she had learned the importance of leaning on others when needed. It wasn't a sign of weakness to ask for help, it was a sign of strength. And as time went on, Charlotte's strength continued to grow. The palace, too, began to embody this new mindset. The royal staff, once strictly focused on their duties, began to take a more holistic approach to their work. They ensured that the mental and emotional well-being of all the family members was prioritized, not just their public personas. The realization that royal duties could be demanding both physically and emotionally had become a central part of the conversation in the palace. In the months that followed, Charlotte continued to attend public events, but with a new sense of balance. She no longer felt compelled to hide her feelings or push through discomfort for the sake of appearances. She knew now that it was okay to take a step back, to focus on herself when needed. It wasn't about abandoning her royal responsibilities. It was about managing them in a way that allowed her to be her best self, both for the country and for her family. Her journey to recovery also brought her closer to the people she loved. She and her mother, once distant in the way many royal families were, grew even closer. The Queen, seeing her daughter's vulnerability, had come to understand her own need for emotional connection. Their relationship deepened, and they began to spend more time together, having conversations that were more than just about royal matters. They spoke openly about their fears, their hopes, and their dreams for the future. Charlotte's healing was not just a personal journey, it was a journey for their relationship as well. As time went on, the palace transformed. It became a place where people could talk about their struggles, ask for help, and find support. The walls that had once stood strong, keeping personal matters behind closed doors, began to come down. And with it, the royal family became a beacon for change, showing the world that even the most powerful figures were human, with their own battles to face. For Charlotte, this transformation marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She was no longer just a princess in the public eye. She was someone who had learned to face her fears, embrace her vulnerability, and most importantly, care for her well-being. And as she continued to grow into her role, she carried with her the lessons of self-compassion and authenticity, lessons that would guide her through the rest of her life. Part 5, Co-expand Crow without heading 1,500 words in simple English words. It should be interesting, and every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. And don't use any violated word. Avoid any violated content. As the months passed, Princess Charlotte's journey toward healing became an inspiring testament to strength and resilience. The princess, who had once been seen as the flawless figurehead of the royal family, was now emerging as a leader in her own right, not because of her perfect appearances or flawless performances, but because of her willingness to embrace her imperfections and face her struggles. Head-on, the transformation was gradual, yet every day brought Charlotte closer to the person she was meant to be. The decision to speak openly about her mental health had been a turning point, not just for Charlotte, but for the entire royal family. It was no longer about upholding the image of an unshakable monarchy. Instead, it was about showing the world that even the most public figures experience personal struggles and challenges. Mental health, once a topic seldom discussed in the royal family, had now become an important conversation. The royal family had learned a vital lesson about the importance of vulnerability and the power of support. For Charlotte, the healing process had been both rewarding and difficult. It wasn't easy to confront the emotions she had buried for so long, the pressures, the fears, and the overwhelming weight of her responsibilities. But as she learned to care for herself, she also realized something even more powerful. It was okay to ask for help. She didn't have to carry the burden alone. She had her family, her advisors, and a network of trusted professionals who were there to support her every step of the way. Charlotte's recovery didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day, she grew stronger. She began to embrace the idea of self-care, something she had once viewed as a luxury or weakness. She learned to recognize her own limits and understood that it was perfectly acceptable to take a break when she needed it. Her royal duties, though still demanding, were now balanced with moments of personal reflection and relaxation. Charlotte no longer viewed herself as a machine meant to serve the needs of the monarchy. Instead, she saw herself as a person, someone who could contribute to her country and family, but who also deserved to take time for herself. Her newfound sense of balance allowed her to engage in her royal duties in a way she never had before. She attended public events with a calm and genuine presence, speaking openly with those she encountered and taking the time to listen to their concerns. No longer confined to the image of perfection, Charlotte was able to connect with people on a deeper level. The public noticed the change in her. There was something more authentic about her now, something that resonated with those who looked up to her. She wasn't just a princess. She was someone who had experienced hardship and emerged stronger, someone who was real, relatable, and above all, human. The public's perception of the royal family began to shift as well. The walls of formality that had once separated them from the people came down. The royal family, led by Charlotte's example, began to open up about the challenges they faced, not just as public figures, but as individuals. The image of the perfect monarchy, once so carefully guarded, was replaced with a more relatable and accessible version of royalty. People began to see that the royals, too, struggled with their own lives, just as anyone else would, and this change was welcomed by the public. It gave them a sense of connection to the family they had once viewed from a distance. The Queen, too, had undergone a transformation during this period. The realization that Charlotte's struggles were, in part, a result of the pressure placed on her by the royal family had opened the Queen's eyes to the need for change within the palace. She had always been a strong, dignified figure, but now she understood that true strength came not from maintaining an unyielding exterior, but from embracing vulnerability and showing care for others. The Queen began to spend more time with Charlotte, offering not just guidance, but emotional support. Their bond grew deeper as the Queen realized that the path to healing was not just about restoring physical health. It was about restoring emotional well-being, too. Charlotte's relationship with her family also strengthened. The once silent, reserved atmosphere in the palace gave way to open conversations and shared understanding. The royal family, having witnessed Charlotte's growth, began to take mental health more seriously. They acknowledged the importance of being there for one another, both in times of joy and in moments of struggle. The idea of family as a source of strength became more than just a concept. It became a living, breathing reality in the palace. Charlotte's recovery also sparked a broader change in the way the palace operated. The staff, once focused solely on maintaining the monarchy's image, began to place more importance on the well-being of those who lived within the palace walls. It was no longer just about looking perfect in public. It was about fostering a healthy and supportive environment at home. The palace hired mental health professionals to support not just Charlotte, but the entire royal family. They began to host regular wellness sessions and workshops, ensuring that everyone in the palace was equipped with the tools to manage stress, anxiety, and the pressures of their roles. The ripple effects of Charlotte's journey spread beyond the palace, reaching the wider public. Her openness about her mental health struggles became a beacon of hope for many. People, particularly young women, found comfort in knowing that even someone in Charlotte's position could experience and overcome such challenges. Charlotte became a role model not for her perfection, but for her courage in showing vulnerability. She proved that it was okay to take a step back, to prioritize one's own health, and to seek help when needed. As the months went by, Charlotte's role as a princess evolved. She no longer saw herself as a figurehead, a symbol of perfection. She became a symbol of hope, of growth, and of the power of personal healing. Her story wasn't just about a royal family recovering from a crisis. It was about a young woman learning to take control of her own life, to be kind to herself, and to let go of the unrealistic expectations that had once defined her. Charlotte continued to fulfill her royal duties, but now with a sense of purpose that went beyond tradition. She was no longer just fulfilling an obligation. She was leading by example, showing the world that personal well-being was just as important as public duty. She used her platform to raise awareness about mental health, encouraging others to speak openly about their struggles and seek help when needed. She worked with charities and organizations that supported mental health, using her influence to make a difference in the lives of others. In time, Charlotte became a powerful voice for change within the royal family and beyond. She helped to shape a new era of monarchy, one that was built on compassion, understanding, and authenticity. The royals no longer tried to maintain an image of invulnerability. Instead, they embraced the truth that everyone, no matter their status or position, had challenges to face. And in facing those challenges, they found strength. For Charlotte, the road to recovery had been long, but it had led her to a place of deep peace and fulfillment. She had learned that strength wasn't just about power or perfection. It was about accepting oneself and showing up for others. She had emerged from her struggles not only as a better princess, but as a better person, someone who could face the future with confidence, knowing that she was no longer alone in her journey. As the years went on, Charlotte's legacy as a leader of change and empathy only grew. She had become a symbol of hope for those who felt unheard, unseen, or misunderstood. Her courage to face her struggles head-on had inspired an entire generation to do the same. In the end, Charlotte had not only saved herself, but had helped to heal the monarchy, bringing it closer to the people it served. Through her story, she showed the world that even the highest among us are not invincible, and that strength is found in our ability to ask for help, to heal, and to grow.